Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us at what is a very early hour European time, a little bit more civilized in Asia, and I won't make comments regarding Latin America. Welcome to Government After Shock, an unconventional event for these unconventional times, and a unique opportunity for us to try to make sense of what is an extremely complicated context. I'd like to welcome everyone to this event being put on with the support of the European Commission through its Horizon 2020 program and the technical sponsor, Microsoft. My name is Anthony Gooch. I am the Director of Public Affairs and Communications of the OECD. During the day, we encourage you to get involved in this session using the modules on the right-hand side of your screen. The discussion module is a space to share any comments or insights you have in relation to the panel. Please ask your questions to the panel in the questions module, and you can also upvote other people's questions using the thumbs up button on the question. And if you would like to be active on social media, we very much encourage that. Please use the hashtag GovAfterShock. Today is one part of a broader conversation. Yesterday, over 60 groups around the world ran their own GovAfterShock events. There were discussions ranging from digital government, sustainable development, trust and inclusion, governing for an uncertain future, the climate crisis, government communications, and moving beyond crisis. While each of these events had a different angle and were involving different people, they all shared a common focus, contributing to our three core Government Aftershock questions. What do we need to leave behind from this crisis? What do we want to keep? And what should we do differently? Each has helped provide some insight into what this crisis means and what it has revealed about the role and expectations of government now and into the future. The crisis has clearly emphasized the vital role of the state. For many, it is a return of the state. It's not the first time we've heard that. Let's cast our minds back to 2008. Where would we have been without the lender of last resort? And it's highlighted the need for strong public sector capabilities and capacities. This crisis has also shown that it's possible for government to work in different and more flexible ways with the private sector, with all stakeholders, with the broader community. When I say it's possible for government to work in this way, government also hasn't had much choice in the matter. I think many would agree. The crisis has shown that things can be done very differently when they really need to be. And the question for us is, can we learn from this? Can we build a more flexible, anticipatory, and resilient state than we had before? Can we afford not to, as we face future crises, both known, such as the climate crisis, and perhaps a known unknown, such as the pandemic? Whilst we knew that pandemics were possible and they have occurred, no one, I think, was betting on a pandemic in 2020. Today's program will help answer these questions with different sessions looking at different angles of how governments might need to shift to be effective for a post-COVID-19 world. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests for this kickoff panel. We have the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria. We have the Prime Minister of Serbia, Ana Brnabic. And we have the Prime Minister of Latvia, Artūrs Krišjānis Kariņš. Unfortunately, due to last-minute health situation, the President of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid, cannot join us. Now, I wish to begin by giving the floor, the virtual floor, so to speak, to Prime Minister of Latvia, who is joining us through video link. He has prepared remarks for this session. So the floor is yours.
Dear friends, the COVID crisis is unfortunately not over and we're not out of the woods, but there are certain trends that we see and certain things I think that we have learned and we need to put in place. The first is speed of reaction. During the first wave, my country was one of those that reacted very quickly. Before the first person had died of COVID-19 in Latvia, we already had restrictions down to 2 people and 2 meters. So speed of reaction was very quick and important, and we were able to get the curve down. Second is getting society to work with government, not against government. During the first wave, we were very fortunate that we explained what the danger was. We explained how we were going to address the danger, and we invited everyone to cooperate, and that cooperation was very extensive. The result was a huge success in getting the wave down, getting the curve down very quickly, very efficiently. The difficulty is, for a country like ours, the success led to certain difficulties when the second wave came around. So in the first wave, we simply had to fight the virus. Now, since that time, everyone has seen the effect on the economy. So restrictions also meant people losing their wages, losing jobs. We had many programs to reinforce, furlough programs, aid programs, but nevertheless, that caused stress. So when the second wave was coming, and we could see it rising throughout Europe, throughout the world, there was lots of discussion also within our society, how quickly we should react, how many restrictions we should impose. And that led to a slower down reaction time and a more time it took to get government and society to be on the same wave. So if the first time around, we were able to make all decisions roughly within 10 days, the second time it took us closer to 3.5 weeks. The result is right now we are in a similar restricted mode as we were in the spring, but the cases have gone up considerably more, and unfortunately deaths are climbing as well. So I think in Europe, in societies where freedom and democracy are at a very high value, we have a challenge of convincing people to adhere to restrictions. We live in societies that are based on openness, and yet this pandemic requires us to give up some of that openness to protect our health. And it's this dialogue between the government and society which is crucial. We had discussions within the government, dissenting views, different views I should say, and also between our health experts, because no one has a perfect guideline for doing it. But what's key in the both waves, what we've seen in our country, is quick reaction time is key, but reacting together with society. So no government can go faster than society is willing to follow. And the second time around, it took us a little more than 3 weeks to pull government and society into a collective understanding of what we have to do. I think we have to understand that we're probably in this for a little bit, which could be called the long haul. We're all also in Latvia very hopeful on the news that's coming out about a potential vaccine, but we realize that there are many difficulties ahead, not least of which are logistical difficulties in distributing widely a medication that requires a -70 centigrade storage. So these are huge challenges for all of us. And as the vaccine hopefully will be approved, and maybe some more will be approved, and as that vaccine would be distributed over time into our societies, raising immunization, we have to already now prepare for what could be a third wave. And that means continuing to inform society on how we can protect ourselves and think about the more safety measures we can have effective during times when the epidemic is low, the fewer restrictions we'll have to bring in if that wave really comes again. So once again, speed of reaction and getting society to cooperate with government is key. What we as heads of government need to do to ensure this cooperation between government and society is inform, inform, inform. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish all of you the best of health.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I think in a very distilled and short space of time, we've heard a lived experience, a personal testimony, someone at the hard end, having to essentially pick out what were the key elements. And I think in hearing him, many around the world will probably be quite envious that in the case of Latvia, the government and society managed to turn everything around in just 10 days. Compared to many, I'm sure that was an extraordinarily short time lag. But equally, his testimony that second time around, it was almost 4 times longer to achieve that same goal. And the connection with society at large, the fact that a government cannot actually go quicker than its society is willing and able to do and to manage. I also picked up on the fact that there was no perfect guideline. It's true that we're flying, perhaps not blind, but we were certainly flying without the types of instruments that governments are used to having in circumstances of this type. Of course, now a few months down the track, the situation has clarified itself somewhat, but there remain many issues that are open. And of course, there is an aspect that I hope we'll be able to touch on later as well, where whilst we see the very positive news coming through regarding vaccines, that we don't forget there will be an extra mile. It's often the case in our context that we assume rational behavior, and we know how irrational the period that we are living is, and the key to ensure that we get to a point of immunization, which means that people actually are willing to be vaccinated. And that is a whole challenge in and of itself. If it wasn't enough to have the challenge to produce the vaccine and then to deliver it, as the Prime Minister said, logistically. Let me now hand the floor for introductory remarks to the Secretary General of the OECD, Ángel Gurría.
Prime Minister Brnabić, in particular, who I see sitting in there so early in the morning, thank you so much for joining us. It's so important for us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to welcome you this morning to the Government Aftershock event. The world is in the grip of an unprecedented health, social, and economic crisis. The latest OECD economic outlook projects a fall in world GDP of 4.5% in 2020, a contraction in the world GDP of 4.5% in 2020. There is some good news regarding a potential vaccine. We have seen 2 showing very promising results, but we know that this crisis, of course, we will continue, that for the most part of 2021, we will have to learn to live with the virus as the vaccines are not only developed and approved, but also produced and eventually distributed. Now, our work must also continue and adapt to new realities. Governments have already taken extraordinary and swift measures through income support and expanded sick leaves. trillions. You know, normally we would talk about billions. Now the units are the trillions. Trillions of dollars have been directed towards supporting households and companies across the OECD and in some other countries. Government's responses were not only bold, they were also innovative. From experimenting with better approaches to communicate with citizens, to coordinating with communities in new ways during lockdowns, or even massively shifting to remote work. Governments have had to try new things under these difficult circumstances. However, more must be done. The crisis is exacerbating underlying issues, such as inequalities, economic insecurity, unevenness of health care access, just the sheer access to the medical support. It has also aggravated the crisis of trust. And more crucially, it has inserted fear in the social fabric of many countries and economies. Urgent action is also required to combat the next global crisis, which is climate change. Please remember, the single most immediate thing we have to do is fight the pandemic and its health and economic and social consequences. But the most important intergenerational responsibility that we have is with the planet. Now, this crisis has highlighted the decisive role of governments and public institutions. It underlines how a trusting relationship between people and their administration is pivotal when addressing societal challenges. High trust goes hand in hand with better compliance and with better results. And the Prime Minister of Latvia just told us how crucial, how critical the part about trust is. We have results from about 233 regions in 19 European countries, and they all show that mobility related to non-necessary activities in high trust regions was significantly lower than in low trust regions. So people's perception of government's competence, of their integrity, of their openness, of their fairness, all is crucial, all matters so much. OECD surveys in Finland and Korea showed that the reliability and responsiveness of service delivery significantly influences people's trust in their governments. In short, governments matter, and they matter more than ever. Let me give you a few examples. The pandemic has disrupted the global value chains behind the production of some essential goods. For example, face masks, okay? This raises the issue of the security of supply. Now, governments can address this through better use of public procurement, risk mitigation, and international regulatory cooperation. And cooperation more broadly. Second, this year has shown us more than ever the importance of digital governance. Now we need to ensure that the digital economy is a strong contributor to productivity and well-being. And this means implementing the necessary regulation for platform companies, for which we need governments, because we need governance. Lastly, the pandemic underscored the fragility of communicating scientific evidence. It's a difficult art. Disinformation threatens the efficacy of policy measures, undermining trust, amplifying fears, leading to harmful behavior. Our governments can and need to fight disinformation by being more open and engaging directly with the citizens. The OECD has supported governments' crisis response efforts. Our COVID-19 digital hub contains over 160 policy briefs, has received over 1.3 million unique visitors, mostly policymakers, I have to say, which is very, very encouraging. We also held our ministerial council meeting on the 28th and 29th of October, just a few days ago. And the title was Strong, Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable Recovery from COVID-19. So, distinguished guests, prime ministers, dear Prime Minister of Serbia, dear Ana, delighted to have you. The phrase, quote unquote, public office is a public trust, has never been truer. The list of policy changes that governments need to tackle goes way beyond the pandemic. Inequalities, governing the digital, advancing climate change, or fighting climate change, rather, to name just a few. Yesterday, we heard the voices of local stakeholders gathered in over 60 events around the world. Today is our chance to reflect on the role of governments. And I look forward to this conversation. And I wish you a very productive exchange. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, and we will be coming back to you shortly in a series of questions that we're going to be able to address. And now I'm delighted that we are joined by the Prime Minister of Serbia, by Ana Brnabić, again, someone who's had to occupy that hot seat during the last few months, which is an unenviable task. Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Mr. Secretary General, great to see you, and I hope to be able to see you in person, hopefully very soon. And I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this important conference. I think that all of us, and especially myself as the Prime Minister, is someone who is, as you have said, in the hot seat during this pandemic, as any other Prime Minister around the world. I will probably benefit the most from learning about different examples and hearing you and your views about how government can face this, what is the right way to respond. And I think that as the Prime Minister of Latvia has said, I think that we are also unfortunately still searching for the best possible response, and we'll probably not know what the best response was perhaps in the, we will learn about this perhaps in a few years when we know more about COVID virus. Right now, with all of the technology that we have, with all of the data that is available, with all of the expert medical help and support, I think still we are changing and adapting our policies to the situation which is changing day in, day out. Different countries trying out different methods to fight the disease, flatten the curve, support its healthcare system. And some are more successful, some are less successful, but I'm, to be honest, very open, very honest, as confused as any of our citizens in what is the best way to respond to this. And also, what I've tried to do and what we've tried to do here in Serbia is try to balance between the adequate response, which will protect the healthcare and the healthcare system and the health of our citizens, and the adequate response, which will also balance this with the needs of the economy. Because at the end of the day, if we do not find a way that the economy functions, at least to a minimum extent, we won't get the budget, we won't get the money into the budget to actually pay for all of the extraordinarily additional costs that this pandemic requires. Buying protective equipment, buying tests, buying ventilators, additional crazy costs that we have for the healthcare in general because of the occupation rate of our beds and the working hours that are now invested by our healthcare workers. Additional costs for the vaccine for seasonal influenza, because again, we had to vaccinate much more people than ever before, and the interest was bigger than any year in the past. Additional money for COVID vaccines, because everyone is asking the governments to pay in advance to basically reserve their place in the queue for the COVID vaccine. We don't know which vaccine will be registered first or which vaccine will be registered at all. But if we are responsible, we will want to wait in all of these lines, and all of that costs money. Now, those extraordinarily budgetary expenses, although I think all of us will, in addition to suffering GDP decline, and Mr. Secretary General has just said that the fall in GDP will be 4.5% on the world level, which is unbelievable, and it will take years to recover. All of us will suffer enormous budgetary deficits because of this extraordinary spending. At the same time, even though we are prepared for these deficits, and we kind of mentally came to terms with it, we still have to have some budgetary input so that these deficits are, I would say, moderate, or at least that it will take us 2 to 3 years to recover and come back to some kind of a fiscal stability. So that's why we also needed to balance out with our economy. I think in Serbia, we were overall very, very successful. When I became the Prime Minister in 2017, I put digitization at the top of the list of my priorities. E-government, so fully digitizing the government to provide as many of electronic services to citizens and businesses as possible. Reforming schools in order to have digital textbooks, digital classrooms, make it more interesting to kids to go to school, but also easier for them to learn, and also try to teach them how to think rather than what to think. Also investing in digitization of our economy and transferring Serbian economy from labor-intensive investment-driven to innovation-driven and knowledge-based in order to increase to make our GDP growth more dynamic. And all of that has paid off during 2020 when we were faced with this kind of pandemic. we did not do these reforms because we knew that the pandemic will come. We did them to make our government more efficient and more transparent, and to make our economy more efficient. Now, I have to say that I'm very pleased that, we never stopped providing services to our citizens, because already by 2020, we could provide many of our services fully electronically, both to citizens and to businesses. I'm very proud to say that we are one of the rare countries in Europe and one of the rare countries in the world that did not lose one single day of schooling in 2020. When the pandemic was very high, we had to stop schools, but we stopped schools physically, kids going to school on Friday afternoon. Monday morning, we were already online. And so, all that we invested in digital education paid off. The economy, thanks to everything that we have done, became much more resilient. We have invested also about 13% of our GDP to support the economy, so that the pandemic doesn't kill our small and medium-sized enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises first and foremost. But by this time, by 2020, because we invested so much in innovation-driven economy, the ICT sector has already reached 6% of our total GDP. And we have seen the ICT sector and overall services sector in terms of IT, innovation, research and development did not fall faced with the crisis. Everything else fell considerably, especially industrial production, manufacturing, and these kind of things. But still, we were able to protect our economy to the extent that our GDP this year, by the end of this year, will be minus 1%. I'm hoping even 0.7%. So it was good. The unemployment did not increase. To be honest, the unemployment was further reduced because of the support that we provided to young people, and the program that we launched, My First Salary, which was also featured as a case study by OECD, and I thank you very much for that. So we were able to fight this quite well during 2020 because we invested so much in digital. Now, the world has changed, the government has changed, public services have changed, and we will have to continue changing. What my worry is, apart from the fact that I know we need to focus more, I fully agree with Secretary General, we have to though also keep our focus on climate change. But what I worry will happen in the world globally, that OECD is probably the best place to discuss, debate and find solutions, is that the gap between rich and poor will be further increased. Because, and what we have seen in Serbia, and I will finish with this, is that labor-intensive investment-driven economies, poor countries will suffer more, because in the labor-intensive economies, you basically weren't able to produce at all during 2020. And as Secretary General has said, the supply chains have changed and will keep changing, because countries will want to move productions closer to home. The richer, more advanced economies and societies, those innovation-based, knowledge-based, innovation-driven, research and development societies have suffered less and will continue to suffer less. And the gap between rich and poor countries and rich and poor societies might be something that will be very, very difficult to overcome in the future due to this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, I think it's fascinating for our audience to have this direct and personal testimony on the one hand of what happens in a country specifically. Again, I would say that just as with what we heard from Latvia, I think that there will be many around the world who will be hearing with a degree of envy regarding what has occurred, for example, on the GDP front. There are many countries around the OECD and beyond that have suffered very profoundly, and equally on the unemployment side. And I think we've heard a great deal regarding the amplification of issues of concern that we had before, both from the Secretary General and from the Prime Minister. And we're going to have an opportunity to delve a little bit more deeply into that. What I'd like to do now is to turn back to the Secretary General and to ask you, and this is really part of what the OECD is all about. I know it's sometimes a little bit delicate, but down the years you've built up a reputation for being pretty straight with governments, for good and when things needed to be improved a little bit as well. What do you feel, Secretary General, that the crisis has revealed about the strengths and weaknesses of governments?
Thank you. Well, I think Prime Minister Brnabić comment made it just made it very clear about the difference between a government that is, the pandemic took us all by surprise, but at the same time that was better prepared, but then reacted very fast, and then has, as Tony Good said, enviable numbers in terms of the drop in GDP or the increases in unemployment, or in her case, employment, because by the support systems that she applied to the youth in particular, actually employment may have gone up. But basically, we have to say this took us unprepared. It took us by surprise. Even in countries which we had ourselves classified as being the best prepared for something like this, proved very, very unprepared and inefficient, actually. But there's been something quite important, and that is within the pandemic, in the period of the pandemic, now it's been 8 months or something like that, many of the governments reacted very fast. And here I like to render homage to those that actually duplicated or sometimes even tripled their beds, their capacity to deal with intensive care, with ventilators, simply with staff, with the doctors, with the nurses, with the paramedics that were necessary. It's quite important. I was talking about trust here. Only 37% of the people in the OECD countries consider that they have something to say or something to do, or that they say is important in what the government does. So this is a moment, a pandemic is a moment when you absolutely have to get the governments and the people together. The element of trust has to be the glue. It has to be the binding element that makes it possible, because otherwise the government policies will not succeed. If people do not believe in what the government is telling them, if people actually in many cases believe that what the government is telling them is by definition not true, then of course it will be much more difficult to overcome a situation like the one we're facing now. So you're basically talking about Tony, I think are we saying inequalities for the first time? No. Are we saying the problem of skills? The Prime Minister mentioned that in the case of the lower skilled, of course, they were finding it more difficult. We know that it is much more difficult to reinsert them into a job market, which is going to be, by definition, more digital as we go forward and as we go to the post-COVID period. And therefore, we have to focus on the question of the digital education, the digital skills of the people, especially of the low-skilled, for them to be able to plug in, to incorporate into the economy of the future. Again, it takes a multilateral approach. This is the last thing I would like to say. This is the most global of all the phenomena that we have faced. This is by definition now the pandemic, the pan part of the, it means it's all over the place. It took the WHO several months actually to declare it a pandemic because they had to make sure that it was all over the place. And it is. It is affecting every single country in the world, even the smallest islands, the furthest apart, etc. And therefore, how do you deal with a global issue, a truly most global issue like this one, if not with global approaches, with international cooperation, with international collaboration through a multilateral approach? Just like trade, just like investment, just like climate change, just like biodiversity, just like migration. But if we needed an example of how important it is for the world to cooperate with each other, this is it. It's very clear. And clearly, when the Prime Minister mentioned the problem of vaccines, for example, the fact that you have to stand in line in so many lines and put money, put money first, pay in advance to see whether they're going to make it or not make it, or whether you're going to have a success or not a success. It just shows you that when you should take vaccines as a public good and then make it available à fur et à mesure, depending on the needs throughout the world. So thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you. Let me turn again to you, Prime Minister, with this same question, and inviting you not just to focus on your own country, but maybe what you have observed in terms of strengths and weaknesses of government. So without looking at it necessarily from the perspective of personalization, but more the function of government, where you've seen those strengths and those weaknesses, because people often say that crises like these, what they are real stress tests. So they're the moments where you can see whether the edifice is resilient and robust. And you cited a number of examples of the measures that you took, in a sense, without knowing that a pandemic was coming, but that stood you in good stead. And I would perhaps like to hear a little bit more and have our audience hear a little bit more about the project that you cited, because this is a conference about innovation, and you did innovate, and we know that there are many parts of the world where help was put in place, but sometimes it didn't actually reach the recipients. And this project that you had around My First Salary to address youth unemployment, which in the case of Serbia, if my data is correct, was hovering around 25% at the beginning of this year. That was probably a pretty big challenge for you as well.
Well, as I said, I think the key strength of a government nowadays, regardless of the pandemic, but it was reinforced by the pandemic, is to go digital, to innovate, to try and leave the inherent conservatism of a government by bureaucracy and think of the ways in which we can be of service and available to the citizens and to businesses 24/7, 365 days a year. And if you go fully digital, meaning if you introduce electronic government as much as possible, then you are available all the time to your businesses and to your citizens. One challenge that we have going ahead, which I think is a good challenge, I think it will help all of us work better for our citizens and for our businesses and be more efficient, is the use of artificial intelligence in the government. If you think about the bureaucracy of the government, you then think of, perhaps to be on the conservative side, 30% of the job that civil servants are doing is repetitive job. Someone applies for a permit, you can basically tick the box whether they have all of the data, that is all of the information, all of the data, all of the conditions are met to issue that permit. Well, instead of using thousands of civil servants to do this, you can basically use artificial intelligence and automate some of these programs. That would be fantastic. That would also mean not only that these people do some more meaningful work, but that also you can issue permits at 2 o'clock in the morning, 24 hours you can work. Can you imagine what kind of productivity increase and efficiency increase that would mean for governments? It's a completely different government, especially faced with the pandemic such as this one. That means that you have no physical contact with people. I wanted to cut physical contact between government as such, civil servants, and citizens and businesses, because I think that in the age that we are living in, it's senseless to force people to go down to the municipality, come to the government, go to the police, to bring a paper to finish something. You can do all of that electronically. Plus, if you ask me, that's the best possible way to fight corruption. If you cut all physical contacts and you do all of these things electronically, you basically cut space for corruption, because all of that becomes very, very transparent. And we have seen this, for example, the best example is our construction permitting process. Construction permitting used to be the most difficult, the longest and most corrupt process in Serbia, because it was that difficult. When we changed the law to make it fully electronic, introduce the systems, we are currently amongst the top 10 countries in the world for the efficiency, the speed of issuing construction permits in the world. You could see it, you could physically see it in the number of infrastructure projects across Serbia, especially obviously private infrastructure projects. So again, all of that helped us provide efficient services to citizens and businesses during the pandemic. So again, this is the key strength. My key takeaway is go digital. If you're a government public service, go digital. And I have to add one more thing in terms of the climate change. I don't have numbers here with me, but we are also, I've asked government office for IT and e-government, which I established as the Prime Minister to be a central focus point on this, to make a calculation as of 1st of June 2017, when we started going digital as the government, how much paper we have saved. And then transfer that into the amount of trees that we have saved, amount of water that was made to produce that paper out of those trees, and the electricity. And it's unbelievable. For a small country like Serbia that still did not go fully digital, I'll tell you so it's, as of 1st of June 2017, just by going digital as the government, we have saved 15,000 trees. 15,000 trees means 65 million liters of water and 5,700 megawatts of electricity. Can you imagine if all of us went digital? We would save forests and water. And it's easy, plus you're providing more efficient services. And finally, just a couple of words on my first salary program. When I spoke with youth organizations in Serbia, they told me something that probably all youth across the world is facing, is that when you apply for a job, everyone asks for work experience. And it's a problem that you cannot resolve. You need a job, but you can't get that first work experience. So as the government, we said, okay, we will invest the money and we will pay part of the salaries, at least 50% of the salary, for companies, for that youth, if they provide the first job to youth. Plus, we made it digital end-to-end, so that all of that is online, and it's very transparent. And we are basically doing the application process, both from the companies and from the youth, online, doing the matchmaking, also utilizing artificial intelligence for the first time. And we'll see. Hopefully, in the next 3 weeks, we'll sign the first contract.
I think that will be one to follow very much, because of course here with programs like that, to be able to then learn those lessons and be able to multiply them as best practice, that's part of the DNA that we have at the OECD. Let me now turn again to the Secretary General. Secretary General, what do you think needs to happen to prepare governments to be better placed to face the next crisis? And there's one thing I wanted us maybe to dwell on a little bit, and that's a lesson, hopefully, that we need to learn from the global financial crisis. It's been said that we didn't really do a very good job of accounting for where the money went last time around. There was lots of money pumped into the global economy. There were exceptional measures taken. But then when we look back and say, well, how much of that was green? How much of that was digital? This time around, surely that's one of the things that we really need to be far sharper on, to be able to measure whether or not we met those ambitions that you've been the first to say this is the moment to use the money really wisely and to achieve all the goals that we already had them prior to COVID. If we can unmute you.
Please. Okay. Am I unmuted? What we need to do is to clone Ana Brnabić, and then sell the little clones all over the place, and we will resolve all our budgetary problems here at the OECD. But you're mentioning something which is quite important. What do we need to do next time around? It has almost become a cliche that the recovery has to be green, therefore it has to be sustainable, that it has to be inclusive. That means we have to put people first, and that it also has to be resilient. That means more resistant to the type of events that we have today, which means that whatever we do, we have to do it differently than we have done so far. So going back to normal is the last thing we want, is the normal that we had before, because normal was not good enough. And the question is, we have to start doing, making decisions today with the new scenario already in mind. Why? Because anything we decide today is going to be there in the next 30 or 40 years. That means the technology we choose is going to be affecting or not the environment. The policy decisions that we have today is going to be affecting the inclusion or not in the next 5, 10, 15 years. You're talking about the next generation. And then you're talking about whether we are prepared for the next shock, whether it's going to be a financial crisis or it's going to be another pandemic, or why. Why did this one catch us so unprepared? We are in the 21st century, for heaven's sake, and we do not have a vaccine, and we do not have even a medicine to attenuate some of the symptoms. And, we sent, there are 4 people today, in the space station that were sent by a private sector firm in a rocket, and we do not have a vaccine for a virus. And why? Well, because the last virus did not last long enough. We didn't advance enough in order to discover what were the solutions to the virus. So basically, clearly, right now we know all these issues that became so obvious, that became so evident, that made us so vulnerable and so fragile, or undiscovered, took away the veil from our vulnerabilities, are obvious, and therefore they are the ones that we have to focus on.
Thank you, Secretary General. And now our time is almost up. I'm going to give the last word to the Prime Minister, and I'm going to ask you, Prime Minister, wrap a couple of things into one. What you think needs to happen in terms of preparing governments to be better placed to face the next crisis, but also a personal one, if you don't mind. What personal commitment would you make to do something differently in the light of the experience that you've lived in the last few months?
Okay. I know we are short with time, so I will be very, very brief. One key message. And again, I will be very open and honest, and I will admit that this is something that bothers me very much as the Prime Minister. Again, it's an issue of ever-changing world, and it's a challenge that I don't know how to resolve, or what my attitude towards it should be as the Prime Minister. And that is that that also our perception and the way we understand individual freedoms and civil liberties has changed enormously due to this pandemic, enormously. I was amazed too, and as the Prime Minister of Serbia, I threaded very, very, very carefully on this, because Serbia is also a country which is I think known for better or for worse. Sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's very funny, for its we love conspiracy theories. And if you live in a society which loves conspiracy theories, then you tread very carefully on civil liberties, because everything that you do can be actually perceived as a part of a bigger conspiracy theory, especially in times like this. But when you look at, for example, some of the European societies, which are promoters of democracy and civil liberties, and the birthplaces of democracies, when you think that these societies now force their citizens to identify and then report to the government their immediate social circle, five people that they and then the government allows them to see those 5 people and no one else, and let those 5 people into their homes and no one else, then we are at we live in a very different world of individual freedoms and civil liberties. Not to mention, you know, where does one's personal freedom starts and when does one personal freedom stops? When you have to make wearing masks mandatory, social distancing rules, application to track your movements and contacts, social circles. It's a crazy world where we really tread on a very we need to tread very carefully about what we do to protect civil liberties and individual freedoms, at the same time protecting people's health. So what I'm going to do is the Prime Minister has initiated a larger public debate in Serbia to discuss what people think, people mostly in humanities and social sciences, the institutes, how do they perceive this? What should we do as governments? They should instruct us on how we should behave in those kind of circumstances to protect health, but also protect civil liberties. And again, this is something that I think will emerge as a worldwide problem, even post-pandemic. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank you, Prime Minister, thank the Secretary General, thank the Prime Minister of Latvia, and our best wishes to the President of Estonia. I think we've had a super discussion to kick things off, a lot of honesty as well, lived experience. Now, our audience has the l'embarras du choix, as they say in French. There are 3 sessions that are about to start, event sessions at the top of your screen. And so you can make a choice now between the practice of government, the future of public employment, and innovative responses from government leaders to the crisis, beyond the excellent examples we've already heard